Hello friends, imagine a clear autumn sky on the 12th of November 1996. The clock strikes 3:55 in the evening, and in the city of Shymkent, Kazakhstan, a chartered Kazakhstan Airlines aircraft rises into the sky. On board are small traders from nearby Kyrgyzstan, their hearts filled with plans of reaching India, buying wool, and returning to their markets in Central Asia to sell it. Ordinary people with ordinary dreams, unaware that their journey was about to become part of one of the darkest days in aviation history. At the same time, back in Delhi's Indira Gandhi International Airport, another aircraft prepared to leave a Saudi Airlines flight. Packed inside were 312 passengers, of whom 231 were Indians. These were not tourists, not wealthy elites. They were construction workers, domestic workers, blue-collar dreamers chasing opportunities in Saudi Arabia. For them, this flight symbolized hope for their families. They wanted to build a better life, but fate was planning something entirely different once the Saudi Airlines plane took off. The evening's responsibility lay with air traffic controller VK Dutta, calm, focused, and deeply experienced. He was guiding both the Saudi and the Kazakhstan aircraft from the ground. He cleared the Saudi plane to climb to 14,000 feet after they reported reaching 10,000 feet. Meanwhile, he instructed the Kazakhstan aircraft to hold at 15,000 feet and not to descend further. In aviation, it is a simple but strict rule. There must always be a vertical gap of at least 1,000 feet between two aircraft. That safety buffer is non-negotiable. On his radar screen, Dutta could only see two blinking dots, representing those giant metal birds. His job was to ensure they never got too close. But within minutes, those dots crept nearer, closer, until they merged into one. And then, horrifyingly, the dots vanished. At that very moment, around 100 kilometers from Delhi, in the skies above a small town called Charkhi Dadri, there was a blinding flash, followed by a thunderous boom. The villagers below looked up, stunned. Burning debris rained down on their fields and homes. What they had just witnessed was India's first and only mid-air collision, and it would go down as the deadliest plane crash in Indian history. Both planes were completely destroyed, and every soul aboard perished. News reports that night painted grim pictures. Mass graves being prepared for Muslim victims, funeral pyres rising for Hindu families, and investigators desperately searching through wreckage to recover black boxes. The Prime Minister ordered a judicial inquiry, while experts across the world debated how such a catastrophe could occur. Delhi's outdated primary radar came under immediate scrutiny. But before we explore the deep flaws of that time, it's important to understand the rules of the sky. Just as cars follow lanes on the roads, aircraft follow airways in the skies. These invisible highways are divided into corridors for incoming and outgoing traffic. And just like on roads, altitude adds another layer of separation. The International Civil Aviation Organization mandates that the planes must never be closer than 1,000 feet vertically and 14 kilometers horizontally. To enforce these rules, air traffic controllers keep constant watch through radar and pilot communication. The radar, however, had limitations. Primary radar, the kind Delhi was using in the 1990s, could only show approximate distances, not exact altitude. Controllers had to constantly rely on what the pilots verbally reported. Imagine the stress of manually jotting down heights and speeds for dozens of flights each hour, calculating their flight paths while lives depended on every calculation. It was said that during the 1990s, air traffic control was one of the most stressful jobs on Earth, more nerve-wracking than even surgery or Formula One racing. But on that November evening, a string of mistakes began to line up like holes in Swiss cheese, creating a perfect alignment that allowed disaster to slip through. The Kazakh pilots, instructed to stay at 15,000 feet, descended to 14,000 instead. Why? The black box revealed a chilling detail. The pilots weren't paying full attention to ATC instructions. They were distracted, chatting about airport delays and traffic. Worse still, they didn't properly understand English. A radio operator was on board just to translate ATC messages from English into Russian, but even then, instructions were misinterpreted. What the controller intended was not what the pilots understood. This miscommunication, this tiny misunderstanding in the midst of an outdated radar system and a single air corridor for both incoming and outgoing flights, sealed the fate of hundreds. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the sky had already turned into a graveyard. Before I take you deeper into the shocking investigation and the global changes this disaster forced upon aviation, let me ask you something. If stories like this, stories of real human tragedy, mistakes, and lessons that shaped our world touch your heart, then make sure you subscribe right now. It keeps you connected to these stories that we must never forget. The Charkhi Dadri crash wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was the sum of many small errors that lined up at the worst possible moment. If even one hole in that Swiss cheese model had been blocked, the disaster might have been prevented. At first, suspicion fell on the Saudi plane. Did it climb higher than instructed? Was it at 15,000 feet when it should have been at 14,000? But when investigators recovered and studied the black boxes, the truth emerged. The Saudi aircraft was precisely where it was supposed to be at 14,000 feet. The Kazakhstan aircraft had descended when it should not have. This was not only a case of poor listening, but of systemic flaws. In the 1990s, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. Kazakhstan was a new nation, and its aviation industry was riddled with problems. The reputation of Russian-trained pilots at the time was questionable. Tales circulated of reckless behavior, even of pilots letting children handle the controls or consuming alcohol before flights. Trust in these airlines was shaky, and tragically, the Charkhi Dadri accident added proof to those fears. But blaming just the Kazakh crew is not enough. The system itself was broken. Why was there only one air corridor for both departing and arriving planes? Why were ATCs forced to work with outdated radars that couldn't display exact altitude? Why was global aviation relying solely on spoken instructions in English, knowing that comprehension could fail at any moment? In the aftermath, India and the world realized urgent reforms were needed. The first step was to create separate corridors for incoming and outgoing aircraft, preventing such dangerous overlaps. The second was to install secondary radars that provided accurate altitude data directly, reducing reliance on pilot communication. And the most revolutionary step was mandating the use of TCAS traffic collision avoidance system. TCAS acts like a guardian angel in the sky. It monitors surrounding airspace, and if another aircraft comes too close, it not only sounds an alarm, but also instructs the pilot on the exact corrective action. For example, if another aircraft is rising beneath you, TCAS will tell you to climb higher. It doesn't just warn, it guides. After the Charkhi Dadri crash, India made TCAS compulsory for all planes carrying more than 30 passengers. At that time, TCAS was cutting edge and very expensive. Many countries resisted it, claiming they couldn't afford it, but India stood firm. This firmness pushed the world to follow, and today TCAS is a global standard. The disaster also triggered discussions about language. The Kazakh pilot's lack of English proficiency had contributed heavily to the tragedy. In 1998, India brought this issue to the International Civil Aviation Organization, proposing that English proficiency be made mandatory for all international pilots. After heated debates, this was accepted. Today, any pilot flying internationally must prove their ability to communicate in English, ensuring that instructions are not lost in translation. In the end, the Charkhi Dadri tragedy was not just a heartbreaking disaster, but also a turning point. Out of unimaginable loss came reforms that have saved countless lives since then. Even today, when you look up at the sky and wonder why two planes don't collide, why skies seem so safe despite thousands of aircraft moving at once, the answer traces back to that terrible evening in 1996. Because of the lessons learned there, mid-air collisions have been nearly eliminated. Of course, not all crashes have been prevented. Planes have still gone down, like the Malaysian Airlines flight or the tragic crash in China, but those stemmed from entirely different reasons. The specific problem of mid-air collisions, however, was addressed and solved, and the skies became safer forever. When you think about it, the story of Charkhi Dadri is not only about death and destruction, it's about resilience, about human beings learning from their mistakes, and about a system changing for the better. For the families who lost their loved ones, nothing could ever replace them. But perhaps their loss prevented future losses for thousands of others. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Do you believe aviation authorities around the world are doing enough today? Or are we still waiting for another disaster to trigger more changes? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your perspective.